Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'm finally getting around to making what is essentially part 2 of my Final Fantasy 15 retrospective, where I've already talked about the main game in my 5 years later retrospective, but I did also talk about how I wanted to talk about the DLCs and Transmedia that stemmed from that game, as I've always loved the world building within the main game of Final Fantasy 15, but I've never experienced anything outside of that main game until now. So for making this video, I did end up experiencing most of what there is to offer within the series. Now, there are things within the Final Fantasy 15 universe that I didn't have access to or don't really have that much interest in, but I did end up experiencing the pieces of media within the series that I did find to be the most interesting, and those are what I will obviously be focusing on in this video. But before talking about those things, I do want to do a quick rundown of the other pieces of media that I didn't get to experience within the Final Fantasy 15 universe, essentially making this a conclusive video here on my thoughts on the world of Final Fantasy 15. Now, the first thing to mention here is the Final Fantasy 15 official comic anthology, which, as you can assume, is a comic. However, for some reason, it was only released in Japan with no English localization, so obviously I didn't really bother reading it. I don't really expect it added that much to the series. We do also have a few mobile games within the series that, again, I didn't really bother playing with. The first two of which being really bizarre, as they are also games that exist within the world of Final Fantasy 15. The first of which being King's Knight Wrath of the Dark Dragon, a mobile remake of King's Knight, which was an NES game and Squaresoft's first North American release. You do also have Justice Monsters 5, which is a pinball game that I don't really get why they felt the need to actually make a real version of it. But again, didn't play either of these, and really both of these are unavailable at this point anyway. The other two, I just actively chose not to play. The first of which being A New Empire, which is this MMO strategy game that involves farming for materials to build bases and structures, and I really don't care. Doesn't seem like anything that I personally have much interest in. It doesn't add much to the narrative of the series. The other mobile game is something that I've known about for quite a while, but it wasn't something that I really knew what exactly it was until I did the research here, and that is Final Fantasy 15 Pocket Edition, which I found out is just some abridged version of the main game, where it tells the same story but condenses it for mobile and changes it to like a chibi art style with a more mobile-friendly combat system. It's so bizarre to me that they even bothered making this, especially because it has now been ported to home consoles. But again, it doesn't really seem like anything that integral to the series, so I didn't end up playing it before this video, but to be honest, I wouldn't be opposed to at some point down the road. Now, the main game did have a couple of demos available for release that I didn't get around to playing either. Now, episode Duscae was packed in with Final Fantasy Type 0 HD, and in turn came out well over a year before the main game's release, so it is interesting to see footage of it, to see what had changed in that time, though realistically it is pretty similar content to what you end up getting from the first few hours of the original game. The other demo is the Platinum demo, and is a lot more interesting to me, though it is a shame that I didn't get around to playing it, largely due to the fact that it has been taken down. But it is an entirely original tech demo where you play as an 8-year-old Noctis after having been injured and having to escape his dreams, and from what I've seen, it actually looks pretty good. Again, not really adding that much narratively to the series, and was mostly just reused assets from the main game, but I do still find it interesting that they bothered to create it to begin with, and it's something that I would have been pretty apt to play if it was available. Now, the main game itself also includes some content that I haven't been able to experience, either with it having some events that obviously ended and some crossover events that I just didn't get around to playing, though realistically none of them add anything of substance to the universe, with most of them just feeling like non-canon expansions. For me personally, I always wanted to play the Assassin's Festival event, being a former massive Assassin's Creed fan, with it being a crossover to promote Assassin's Creed Origins, and while again it doesn't do much narratively, it does include a lot of fan service for Assassin's Creed fans, and actually feels like a high quality side quest, which I actually found hilarious in comparison to Ubisoft's part in the collaboration, where in Assassin's Creed Origins, they end up just putting in this really short side quest that comes off as really half-assed, while here it's very clear that Square put a lot more work into it. Now, a side game that I haven't gotten around to playing either is Monster of the Deep, which is another really bizarre piece of media within the series, with it being a VR fishing simulator that takes place within the universe, and you can interact with members of the gang and do tasks for them. But again, who asked for a Final Fantasy fishing game? I mean, I personally found the fishing missions in the main game to be my least favorite side activity there, and for this game to be revolving around that, again, is bizarre to me, especially because it doesn't add anything narratively to the world, outside of some minor interactions with characters from the main game. And with that, that is essentially every piece of media within the Final Fantasy 15 universe that I haven't had the opportunity of experiencing for myself. But we still have a lot to talk about. First up being another side game here, in that being a King's Tale, which was initially a pre-order bonus, but eventually was released as a free game that you can still download from PSN. And it is a retro-styled side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as Regis, Noctis' father. And for what it is, it's fine. I mean, kind of what you would expect from a game like this. It does have a pretty basic style of gameplay and adds in elements that make it a bit unique to Final Fantasy here. But really, gameplay-wise, nothing too intriguing to me personally. Narratively, the premise here is Regis telling a story from when he was younger to a young Noctis, which ends up including some other characters you meet from the main game, like Wescom and Cid. I mean, it is cool to see Regis in action, though realistically, nothing here is of much consequence, especially considering the story is presented as an exaggeration to begin with. Now we can talk about some of the non-games. The first piece of transmedia I experienced was the Brotherhood anime series that was made to expand on the backstories of the core gang in the game. It is split into 5 short episodes, most of which being under 15 minutes, and really can just be looked at as a short film, even when all put together. And like most pieces of transmedia, this series works really well as a way to expand on the Final Fantasy 15 world and give more background on the existing characters, though as a narrative on its own right, it doesn't really work without the context of the main game. But I did find this to be an interesting part of the series, considering it's really our only glimpse at seeing the normal lives of all these characters before the events of the main game. Now, the frame narrative does take place during the events of the main game, with episode 1 starting with Noctis sleeping aboard the Regalia, leading to a flashback of him being injured by a monolith. And later in the episode, he ends up encountering that monolith during a confrontation with the Empire, and the episode ends with him charging towards it, but this storyline doesn't really get picked back up until the final episode. Episode 2 revolves around Prompto, where we get flashbacks seeing a younger, chubbier Prompto trying to lose weight, which is something I never thought I'll see. But also, we do get to see how his friendship with Noctis started, with him finding a puppy as a kid that ended up belonging to Luna Freya, who writes him a thank you letter mentioning Noctis, who does attend his school. So he ends up trying to befriend him, only for Noctis to make a comment about Prompto's weight, which motivates him to not face Noctis again until he's lost enough weight. Again, really weird their entire friendship start off with Noctis body shaming him, but whatever, I guess. Though I did like the added context here between Prompto and Noctis' relationship, along with also adding in the connection between Prompto and Luna. Episode 3 focuses around Gladiolus, with us seeing a flashback of him training a young Noctis, and we see Gladiolus' doubts on Noctis being worthy as king. We do also see Iris and Noctis meet for the first time, while she is lost in the woods, and he ends up taking blame for her disappearance, which leads to Gladiolus gaining respect for him, which I think is a nice way to set up their bond in the series. Then, if you can't tell, episode 4 does revolve around Ignis, with him having flashbacks involving a teenage Noctis, and Ignis helping him get acclimated to his new apartment by cleaning and cooking for him, hoping that he'll become more responsible, to which he is initially ineffective, and this leads to Ignis trying to understand Noctis more. To which by the end of this episode, Noctis does grow to become more responsible. And then we get to episode 5, where we return to the fight with the monolith, where we get another flashback showing his initial interaction with the monolith, and through this we learn more about Noctis' relationship with his father, and afterwards the gang works together to defeat the monolith, and ends up continuing on to Alticia as we see in the main story. Overall, I did enjoy this series and what it added to these characters that I have gotten attached to, though again, at the end of the day, it does feel pretty unimportant in the grand scheme of things, as you would expect from most pieces of transmedia. Next up, the next piece of transmedia we have here is probably the most notable of the bunch, that being Kingsglaive, a feature-length CGI animated film that takes place after Noctis's departure from Insomnia in the main game, and shows us what happened in Lucius after he left, which fills in some pretty major narrative gaps in the story. However, I will say that I did find the first half or so of this film to be pretty slow, though it definitely did pick up towards the end. That early section of the film is more so interesting as a piece of Final Fantasy XV lore than it is as part of an interesting story on its own right. But again, by the end of the film, I did grow a level of respect for it, largely due to how it connects back to the original game in a similar way to how I look at like the Star Wars prequels. Now, with that said, I will say that visually this film is incredible, with this being some of the best CGI graphics I've ever seen. I mean, the character models are incredible, while the animations can be wonky at points. Fight sequences towards the end of the film look insanely detailed and are just really cool to watch. But as for the story, I do feel like this is part of the reason why I didn't really connect with it as much in the beginning, is because it does revolve around an entirely new character here in Nyx Ulrich, a member of the Kingsglaive who did take a while for me to care about, and I didn't find him nearly as compelling as someone like a Noctis. But we do start off the film with a cool scene involving Niflheim's invasion of Tenebrae, where we do see Regis and Noctis escaping while Luna decides to stay behind to help her brother, which was a nice piece of context here, with this setting up what happened to Luna and Ravis ever since those flashbacks that we see in the main game. But afterwards, the focus does shift to introducing us to Nyx and the other members of the Kingsglaive, including Nyx's mentor, Drautos, who plays an important role later on. Eventually, Ardyn does appear to offer a peace treaty between the Lucius and the Niflheim, to which one of the requirements is for Noctis to marry Luna, obviously that setting up the main story of the game. But following this, we do get to see the inner workings of the Lucius government, with us seeing debates between the council and Regis, which is cool world building, but again, nothing particularly interesting to watch. And this does also cause dissension within the Kingsglaive, which again, it is cool to see how Regis's decisions affect the people within his rule, which also adds a bit to the world building here. Luna also plays a major role in the film, with her meeting up with Nyx and ends up working with him throughout the film. Another prominent character here is Glocka, the supreme commander of the Niflheim army and the main antagonist, who is later revealed to be the secret identity of Drautos. And Glocka ends up killing the council members and eventually Regis in his final stand. That is a great moment for his character, and I do really like the depth that this film gives to the character of Regis. But the film also shows how Luna got the Ring of the Lucy, which she eventually ends up giving to Noctis in the main story. But during the final fight with Glocka, we do see Nyx put on the Ring of the Lucy in a last-ditch effort to take him down, during which he calls upon the spirits of the past kings of Lucius, who grant him their power with the cost of his life afterwards. And we do get this pretty awesome looking fight that goes throughout the city, really feeling epic in scale, similar to some of the major boss battles in the game. And the fight ends with Nyx stabbing Glocka through the chest, only for him to die as well, as part of his compromise. And we do get a pretty satisfying farewell to his character as he fades away as the sun rises. And the film ends with Luna leaving to find Noxus in order to give him the ring. And we do get a post-credit scene showing the regalia breaking down, again going full circle, taking us to the events of the main game. Which again, I do have a lot of respect for what this film does as a prequel to the main game, and I do think it works better as its own piece of media than most other pieces of transmedia, though realistically, I can't imagine someone watching this with no intention of playing Final Fantasy XV to begin with, as even though I do think it still works well enough on its own, there are certainly better films to be watching, and also I feel like knowing the context of Final Fantasy XV does make this film a lot better. Next thing to talk about is something that I had no idea existed before making this video, and that is Prologue Parting Ways, a free web novel they released that takes place before Kingsglaive, telling the events that occurred the day before the start of the game. Through this, we learn about what each of the gang were doing, with us seeing Noctis and Ignis heading out for the Citadel, and this novel really shows more of their bond. We do see Gladiolus being prepped for his role of protecting Noctis, which leads to us learning more about the treaty and how it would affect the Crown's Guard and the dynamic within them. Prompto is there. I mean, he does have this storyline about meeting up with his parents, but it really doesn't even lead up to anything. We do also learn about other characters at the Citadel, like Gladiolus' father and Ignis' uncle. We do see more from Iris and Core. We do get some further background on the Kingsglaive that leads into the film. We do also get a scene involving the gang cleaning up Noctis' apartment that leads set up for their trip, and we do get to also see Regis the day before the main game, with him knowing what is to come and him dealing with knowing his fate. And all of this is really great background that, again, I didn't know existed. Was it necessary? No, but I did like how much they were able to cram in here to flesh out the story, which is cool to experience as someone that is really connected to the story and characters of Final Fantasy 15. Now let's talk about the paid DLCs, starting off with the multiplayer DLC, Comrades, which at the time of this recording has already been shut down in terms of its online functionality, but I have played it briefly in the past, though never extensively, and to be honest, never really had that much interest in playing it much more than I already have. The game includes up to 4-player co-op and is set during the 10-year time skip in the main story, where you play as a member of the Kingsglaive and eventually you face off against Bahamut, which leads to the only somewhat important plot point from the DLC, with the Kingsglaive now devoting themselves to protecting Angel Guard, Noctis' resting place, until he awakens, which again doesn't really matter to the overall plot, but is a nice piece of additional lore to the series. Now for the more notable DLCs, each being focused around a different character. The initial set of DLCs focused on each member of the gang, with the first one being episode Gladiolus. Gameplay wise, it does play pretty similarly to the main game, especially if you've played the Gladiolus section from chapter 13 of the main game, as again it's clear that they just reused assets. But the combat here is more focused around a rage meter that increases the amount of damage you deal, and he does also have a valor gauge that allows you to do special attacks. Now all of these DLCs also have additional modes that I didn't really dive that much into, as it really just feels like filler to make it feel like the DLC was more worth your money. Narratively, this DLC is probably the most pointless of the bunch and just feels like something they made just to have a DLC about Gladiolus. I already talked about how much I hated Gladiolus leaving the group in the main game, but to learn that he does all that just to track down Gilgamesh to prove that he's worthy of protecting the chosen king is all pretty dumb. Now I will say that I did enjoy Core's involvement here, where he does act as a mentor figure to Gladiolus, and you do have some interesting conversations with him where we do learn more about his background. But this DLC overall is pretty short. I mean, you can finish it easily in less than an hour, and it mostly comprises of just walking through ruins and getting through a multitude of combat sections. You do eventually beat Gilgamesh just as Core had in the past, and Gladiolus ends up leaving to return to the game, which again just makes this feel like an unnecessary DLC. The next DLC is episode Prompto, which takes place after Prompto gets separated from the group in chapter 11 of the main game, and gameplay wise, Prompto does play pretty differently from the other playable characters, through more of a focus on range combat, and this DLC having elements of like a third-person shooter. It also includes more of a focus on stealth with the ability to perform stealth takedowns. This DLC also surprisingly includes a small open world that you can navigate by snowmobile, through which there are some side quests available, though from what I've played they are not that interesting. Narratively, I did like Prompto more than Gladiolus, but that's not really saying much. I mean, after getting separated from the group, Prompto is found by Magitech troopers who take him to a production facility where he meets up with Ardyn, who tells Prompto that this is where he was born, which from the main story we do know to be true, but it is cool to see Prompto's first reactions to hearing this. As he escapes the facility, we do learn that the Empire did produce demonized human clones, which all look like him, realizing that it's the truth, that he was born there, and he does end up confronting Verstal, the lead researcher on the project, who he turns out to be a clone of, and ends up killing, which I did enjoy a lot of this in how it progresses Prompto's character. It's also around here where Aranea shows up, infiltrating the facility as well, and she ends up helping Prompto escape, and I did like seeing Aranea in this DLC, as I always liked her as a character, but she just didn't have that much to do in the main story. And while again they could have done more of her in the DLC as well, I did like seeing more of her, and I did like the dynamic between her and Prompto, especially when she ends up helping him through his identity crisis later in the DLC. Overall, I do feel like this was a much better exploration of Prompto's character than Gladius's DLC was of him, with Prompto exploring those memories of him as a child that we do see in the Brotherhood anime. And he does end up teaming up with Arnea to take down Verstal's creations, which does lead to the final boss battles in the game, including this massive set piece involving shooting a machine gun that feels pretty grand in scale. But after defeating them, Prompto ends up heading to Gralia to meet up with Noctis, only for us to see Ardyn watching him from afar, obviously setting up his kidnapping. That leads to Noctis finding him in the main game. But overall, I did like episode Prompto here. It's certainly better than Gladiolus', but I do still wish it had more of an impact on the main story. Next up, we have episode Ignis, which was intended to be the final DLC of the series, and to me, it was the best of the first three. I mean, while episode Prompto is longer and probably is a deeper dive into Prompto as a character, episode Ignis is one that ties back into the main story the best, and still does have some great character moments for Ignis, and is the one that's the most interesting to me from a conceptual standpoint, as well as it tells the events of what happened in Altissia after Noctis' battle with the Leviathan. Now, gameplay-wise, it is pretty similar to the main game, but obviously Ignis has his own quirks. In combat, he uses spell daggers, which are melee weapons that are powered by fire, ice, or lightning magic, where you can change between them during combat, which adds a level of variety there. Now, while this DLC is mostly linear, it does take place throughout the entire city of Altissia, which again makes this DLC feel pretty grand in scale, despite the fact that it is a short linear experience. Narratively, again, this fills in the gaps between chapters 9 and 10, with Ignis getting separated from the gang and heads out to rescue Noctis, and along the way teams up with Ravus as he is attempting to find Luna. And I did like having more of Ravus here, as again, I feel like he's another one of these side characters that doesn't have that much to do in the main story. I mean, eventually Ignis is shown a vision of Noctis in the future, having become the true king, and knowing that Noctis will die to save the world, which is a cool scene that recontextualizes Ignis' character in the main game. But eventually Ignis and Ravus find Noctis unconscious and Luna dead, leading to a cool boss battle between Ignis and Ravus, and we follow that up with the final boss of the DLC against Ardyn, during which Ignis ends up using the Ring of the Lucy, giving him extra powers during this final fight. But as a result of using the ring, he ends up losing his eyesight and gets a huge scar across his face, with this explaining what happened to Ignis by the time we see him again in the main story in chapter 10. Where again, we see him already injured there, but don't really get much explanation of how it happened. And we get a pretty great post-credit scene showing a conversation between Ignis and Noctis after the time skip, which does feel like a pretty fitting and emotional farewell to the two characters. Now, there is also a non-canon alternate ending here, where you can choose to side with Ardyn before the boss battle, and if you do, Ignis gets taken to Zignatus Keep, where he finds the crystal, and he gets into a confrontation with Ardyn, where he ends up using the Ring of the Lucy anyway, which means that both choices essentially lead to similar outcomes. But in this outcome, instead of just losing his eyesight, Ignis ends up losing his life instead, and as he starts to die, Noctis and the gang ends up finding him, and it ends up playing out similarly to how the end of chapter 13 did, where Noctis ends up entering the crystal and Ignis ends up getting revived by the crystal, and we still get the time skip where the events again still happen similarly, but this time Ravus is still alive and helps them take down Ardyn, with Noctis surviving the final battle as well. And really all this I feel like is so much less impactful for Noctis' character. I do think so much of what Noctis goes through from chapter 10 on is so integral to his character, and for this ending to just kind of skip all of that and to not even end with him having to sacrifice himself does feel pretty underwhelming here. And to me, it just feels like a cheap version of the main story's events that feels like an even worse and less satisfying ending to the series. But episode Ignis as a whole is pretty strong in my eyes. Again, pretty short, only takes about an hour to finish, but I did enjoy how much it adds to the original story, and I did find it to be more fun to play than the previous DLCs. Now with that, let's move on to the final DLC, episode Ardyn, but before we talk about the actual DLC itself, we have to talk about episode Ardyn Prologue, which is a short animated film that shows us a bit of Ardyn's backstory, and I mean, it's fine. To be honest, I felt like I knew a lot of what this anime showed us from other forms of media within the series, with even some of these events being shown within the episode Ardyn DLC itself. So I mostly find this anime kind of unnecessary. I mean, we do see more of characters like Somnus and Gilgamesh here. We do see some of Ardyn and Era's relationship. And we do see Somnus eventually killing Era, and the gods choosing him as the true king, along with Ardyn being imprisoned on Angel Guard, which is where he is found during the events of episode Ardyn. I mean, this film is fine for what it is. I mean, obviously this did come out before the DLC, and I didn't watch this until after I played the DLC, which I definitely think played a factor here. But to me, it does still feel like a pretty unnecessary piece of media. And with that, let's move on to the actual DLC, which, as I mentioned before, was not something they initially intended on making. There was initially only going to be those 3 main DLCs, but due to the success of the original batch there, they decided to make a season 2 of DLCs that was going to comprise of 4 episodes, the first of which being episode Ardyn here. And when playing it, you can clearly tell the difference between this and the previous DLCs, with this one feeling much more like its own individual game than just an expansion of what we've seen in Final Fantasy 15. And you can tell the amount of work that they put into this DLC, and I think conceptually it is fantastic, as it's following the main antagonist in Ardyn and showing his backstory along with some events that lead up to the main story. The base gameplay is approached in a similar way to previous DLCs, where Ardyn still moves and fights in similar mold to Noctis, but with his own flair thrown in there, with the most notable of these being his ability to demonify his enemies, though really I never found this to be that interesting of a gameplay mechanic. During certain sections you will also have the ability to summon Ifrit, and by doing so unleash some powerful techniques. There's also a bit of customization here with the ability to buy various hats, but to be honest I never really bothered too much with it. Another special ability Ardyn has here is once his HP depletes, he enters overkill mode, where he unleashes more powerful melee attacks, though if you die in this mode, you actually end up having a game over. So most of the time I did end up just reverting back to my normal mode by using some sort of item. Now, like episode Prompto's DLC does have a bit of a small open world that you can explore, that being the city of Insomnia, which is cool, but also strange to be playing as the main antagonist as he playfully rummages around the main character's hometown with the intention of destroying it. And from a narrative perspective, episode Ardyn is clearly the DLC that is the most impressive in scope, with it jumping around from time periods, telling the story of Ardyn over the course of different points of his life, unlike the other DLCs which were mostly focused around a singular event. The DLC does start in medias res, with Ardyn arriving in Insomnia as he starts the assault on the city. We follow that up with a short flashback showing his relationship with Era, with us then being thrown into the year 721, 13 years before the initial scene and 35 years before the events of the main story, where we see Ardyn being freed by Verstil after 2,000 years of captivity. And while getting escorted out there, we do get our first combat section with some Lucian guards, where he discovers his ability to demonify his enemies, which was a really cool way to teach us some of the new mechanics in the game. We then skip 7 months later when Ardyn awakens in Verstil's lab, where you get this explorable section that gives us a whole bunch of lore about the world of Final Fantasy 15, from the geography to the faction politics, and this really just serves as a way for Ardyn to be learning these things as well. This is also where Verstil shows Ardyn the frozen body of Ifrit, with this explaining how Ardyn took control of it to begin with. We also eventually see Ardyn regaining his memories, in which he learns that he was originally chosen to be king, to which his brother Somnus eventually takes that role. And now with a hatred for his brother, Ardyn decides to continue to spread the Star Scourge and find a way to enact revenge against him. And that's when we jump forward back to that first mission, where on Founder King's Day in Insomnia, Ardyn begins his infiltration of the city, where we see him disable a bevy of wall amplifiers, which I found to be the most tedious section of this DLC, as you're essentially doing a similar sequence of events over and over and over again, with very similar styles of combat sections, and this technically takes up a good chunk of the DLC's gameplay, which is why I would consider this DLC's biggest downside. But after that section, we do reach the end game with Ardyn taking on King Regis with the intent of getting him to call on Somnus, who eventually gets summoned through the Ring of the Lucy, and we have our final boss battle with his Lucy form. And I did like seeing more of the dynamic between these two, considering how integral it is to Ardyn's character motivations, but after defeating Somnus, Ardyn decides to try to kill Regis as well, until he is stopped by Bahamut, who commands him to cover the world in darkness and allow himself to be killed by the true king, which we obviously see in the story of the main game. Though here, Ardyn gets the option of submitting or resisting his fate. But the choice itself doesn't really matter in the DLC here, but this really sets up his motivations for his actions over the course of the main game, and is a nice exploration of Ardyn's character. Again, gameplay-wise, it isn't my favorite DLC in the world, but I do really respect what they were going for here, especially from a narrative perspective. And with that, we are down to the final piece of media we will be talking about in this video, the latest piece of media at the time of this recording, and that is the novel, The Dawn of the Future. Which, if you don't know the story behind this book, as I previously mentioned, episode Ardyn was supposed to be the first of a 4-part series. However, the following 3 parts never came out, largely due to the departure of Hajime Tabata, the director of Final Fantasy XV, which led to the development team, Luminous Productions, being sent to work on their own IP, which we now know as Forspoken. But that meant that the DLCs were formally cancelled. However, with the entire plot being outlined, the decision was made to turn these DLCs into a novel instead. So here we have The Dawn of the Future, which I really did enjoy reading. But the entire time doing so, it just made me feel like what could have been. Where I do feel like so much of this would have been really interesting to see in game form. However, obviously now it's just regulated to this written form. Well, this book also serves as an alternate ending to the main game and tries to once again give us a more happy outcome for these characters. And I do like that conceptually that this exists, but realistically, based on the themes of the main story and what the entire main story revolved around, I do feel like the main game does have the more satisfying ending to me. As for narrative, it is structured into chapters, each representing one of the DLCs that was planned. The first chapter does cover the events of episode Ardyn pretty faithfully up until the end, where it makes it clear that Ardyn was supposed to deny his fate, which sets up this entire alternate timeline. Outside of that, everything just plays out the same up until that final scene, where we do have Ardyn wait for Noctis' arrival at the Citadel, only for it to not be Noctis who arrives, but instead a revived Lunafreya instead, which is a cool twist and makes you really interested in what else has changed in this alternate reality. And beyond that, it is all unseen content, with chapter 2 being what would have been episode Aranea, which to me is probably the one that I'm most disappointed that we didn't end up getting to see. As again, I do really like Aranea, but we just don't see much of her, so to have a full DLC surrounding her would have been really interesting. But it's obviously here just in written form. This does pick up immediately after the events of Alticia, with her leading a cleanup effort in Alticia with Biggs and Wedge, and she ends up returning to Gralia, which has been taken over by Ardyn, and she helps refugees escape the city. She does get tasked with taking care of a young girl who was ordered to be escorted out of the city by the late Emperor, and through this we learn more about Aranea's childhood, with her village being destroyed by demons, and she was left to look over the other children while the adults defended the village, which is a nice piece of background to learn about her character, though I personally would have preferred to see more. But Aranea and the girl arrive in Tenebrae, where she learns that the girl is the Emperor's secret granddaughter named Solara. And we end the chapter skipping forward 10 years to find out that Solara has become a demon hunter under Aranea's tutelage. And with that, we get to chapter 3, which was meant to be episode Lunafreya, where we see Luna getting revived during the 10-year time skip and being attacked by demons, where she learns that she has a new ability that allows her to absorb the demons, which I'm pretty sure would have been her gimmick in the game version of the game if it was ever made for you to utilize in combat. But here she does end up meeting up with Solara, who reveals to her that Noctis disappeared 10 years ago, leading to her trying to contact him, only to find out that she can't at this time. She then gets a dream with Bahamut contacting her, telling her that her new calling is to defeat Ardyn, who has become stronger than what the Ring of the Lucy would be able to purge, and she agrees to this deal under the context of her being able to save Noctis. Afterwards, Luna gets a new black outfit, which I do like the symbolism of it now mirroring Noctis's, and she ends up going on a road trip with Sol to find a port to head back to Insomnia. during which they obviously bond, and I do like their conversations about Luna's struggle over doing what she wants versus doing what she considers her duty, which comes to a head when she ends up helping Sol rescue Aranea, which I'm sure would have been a pretty cool boss battle in the game version of the game. But during this rescue mission, we do also learn more about Era, who was the first Oracle, and learn that Lunafreya's new powers here can be used to absorb the Star Scourge. And also we have Luna being asked to save Ardyn, which clearly sets up a redemption arc for him later in the book. Afterwards, she gets another dream, this time from Gentiana, in which she is warned that Bahamut is using her to gather the darkness to destroy Eos, and we really get this setup here for Bahamut being the true main antagonist of the series, leading to the end of the chapter where we return to the scene of her arrival at the Citadel, where we find out that she is not there to kill Ardyn, but instead to work with him. And that's when we get to the final chapter, what was supposed to be episode Noctis. It starts off with Noctis within the crystal, where he sees the memories within it, seeing these flashbacks of Ardyn and Somnus, during which he gains a sympathy for Ardyn. And I did like how this dived deeper into the philosophies associated between these two brothers. We do also get a lot of self-reflection here, with Noctis now regretting not sympathizing with Luna and realizing how immature he's been, and now having the intent of paying back those that have supported him. Noctis also has a conversation with Regis in his dream, which I thought was interesting now with the context of Noctis knowing that Regis knew what was to come. But after this, Noctis awakens and finds Sol waiting for him, who guides him to Hammerhead, with Sol replacing the role of Tauka in the main game of catching him back up to the current events, including what happened to Luna with her arrival and her new powers, along with the fact that she has gone to fight Ardyn, and Noctis obviously leaves to go after her, this time without the help of his friends, which is the point where I kind of realized probably what my major complaint with this alternate ending, with there being a complete lack of camaraderie between Noctis and his friends, which was so integral to the main story. Instead, making this story more so based around Noctis and Luna's relationship, making that the more important story in the game, which simply wasn't the case the first time around. Now, I'm not saying that the story that this book tells is bad, but I just think that thematically the connection to the rest of the series isn't quite there. Back at the Citadel, we do find out that Ardyn refused to work with Luna, leading to him summoning Ifrit, only for her to take control of Ifrit herself, but turning into a demon as a consequence, to which Bahamut appears with him, enacting his plan to destroy the world. He raises the Citadel into the air, to which Ardyn and Noctis follow, and are helped by the arrival of Noctis' friends. Ardyn ends up asking Noctis for the Ring of the Lucy, in turn revealing his plan to destroy Bahamut in the Beyond, which again sets up his redemption arc. But before that, Ardyn does want a battle of kings, which obviously would have just been a boss battle between Noctis and Ardyn, because, I mean, why not, I guess. But Noctis ends up defeating him anyway, and ends up sparing his life, leading to Ardyn admitting that Noctis is truly worthy of being the true king, which I do think is a satisfying conclusion to their conflict. Afterwards, Noctis goes to the roof, where he rescues Luna, with them getting a solid reunion, with Luna declaring her wish to live for something more than just fulfilling her duty. Again, nicely following up on her arc. We also have Noctis going on to take on Bahamut, and is able to defeat him with the help of the other Astrals. Meanwhile, Ardyn essentially takes Noctis' place on the throne and sacrifices himself, going into the Beyond and using the Ring of the Lucy to defeat Bahamut there, and in turn causing his own soul to vanish, a satisfying end to his arc over the course of this narrative. And we essentially get a happily ever after here, with Regis narrating the epilogue, where we learn that the darkness has been defeated and Noctis and Luna end up getting married in Alticia. Again, a great ending for the characters of Noctis and Luna in concept, but I do feel like the original ending fit the themes of the series a lot more. I mean, I do respect that they took the time to write this long of what is essentially an alternate ending just to give these characters a happy ending, though it doesn't really work as well for me. I mean, despite me liking a lot of the concepts here, I do like that Ardyn gets a redemption arc. I do like Bahamut being the true final antagonist. I do like the further background we get on characters like Ardyn, Somnus, and Aranea. And I do like the roles that Luna and Noctis play here. But to me, this just feels so much like a fan fiction than something that actually fits within the universe. But with that, that is every piece of media within the Final Fantasy 15 universe that I cared enough to talk about. This video ended up being way more expansive than I ever thought it was going to be. I originally thought this was just going to talk about the DLCs, then it expanded to Kingsglaive, and then Brotherhood, and then Dawn of the Future, and then it was just a whole massive rabbit hole from there. But I do feel like this feels like a conclusive video on my thoughts on the Final Fantasy 15 universe, which again, I do have so much respect for, in its world and its characters that I've grown to love. Now, even more so, beyond the course of that original game. While the pieces of media themselves are very hit or miss, I did end up enjoying the process here of experiencing a lot of the transmedia, a good chunk of which I didn't even know existed. But that does wrap up my thoughts on the series of Final Fantasy 15. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be doing very similar videos to this for other series down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.